Coming up in our first ever episode, I'm going to lay out my case for why yet another podcast about video games needs to exist, how searching for games you've never played can lead to some awesome discoveries, and why my philosophy on gaming is a little bit different from everybody else's. I'm Sean Jordan, and I am your great game guide. So, 20 years ago, I was managing a video game store, EB Games to be specific, and pretty much every day I'd have people coming in looking for recommendations about games that could help them chase that feeling of whatever video game they had just completed. So one game that was super popular in 2005 was the original God of War. It's a great game, but it's also a really short one. And so we get customers coming in asking for other games like it, preferably for the PlayStation 2. And that question was actually a little trickier to answer than you might realize, because part of what people really liked about God of War was the Greek mythology, sure, but they also liked Kratos' weapons, the Blades of Chaos, these swords on chains anchored to his wrists that allowed him to battle lots of enemies at once. And they liked the way the puzzles broke up the action, and the big boss battles, and the cool quick-time event showdowns that let Kratos go nuts on his biggest enemies. And God of War was also sort of a surprise hit that year, a game nobody really saw coming, but which made a huge impression once it arrived. That meant there wasn't really anything else like it on the market yet, and it would take a few years before we got there. So, how do you make a recommendation for a game someone's going to love when you've got something so new and different? I know what other game stores recommended, because customers would bring in those games and trade them in and complain that they had been steered in the wrong direction. A few of the games they would bring back were things like The Scorpion King, Rise of the Akkadian, Gladiator, Sword of Vengeance, and Colosseum, Road to Freedom, all of which might have seemed superficially like God of War, but were nothing like it. And they were also pretty crummy games. I also had people complaining that they had been recommended games like Devil May Cry or Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time. And you know, those recommendations were actually decent ones, and they were a little closer to the mark, but still not quite right for those who wanted something similar to Kratos' adventure. There were two games that did satisfy a lot of people, and I'd be surprised if most people are familiar with either of them. The first one was Spartan Total Warrior, an offshoot of the Total War games by the Creative Assembly, featuring a rather loose interpretation of historical battles between Sparta and Rome. This was a game that had a lot of the ultra-violence and ancient Greek backdrop God of War was popular for, but it also lacked the puzzles and the platforming that gave you a break between hacking hundreds of dudes to death. The other game was Rygar, the Legendary Adventure, a vastly overlooked game from 2002 set in a fantasy world inspired by several mythological traditions. What made this game such a great recommendation was its unique weapon, the Disc Armor, a razor-sharp spinning shield attached to Rygar with a cable. The gameplay in the PS2's Rygar is very similar to God of War's in several ways, and while it's not as refined and there's definitely more of a Japanese style to it, many of the people I recommended it to came back later and said it was absolutely what they were looking for. All in a day's work for a game store manager, right? But keep in mind that those conversations weren't usually about just one game. I had to do that constantly with games for a dozen different platforms and from varying styles of play. One day it might be helping someone find a new JRPG to play. One day it might be a sports or racing game for their Xbox. And another, it might be searching for a Pokemon-style game for their Game Boy Advance. I couldn't possibly play all the games that were available. The PlayStation 2 alone had thousands of them. And we also carried games for the GameCube and the Xbox and the Game Boy Advance and the Nintendo DS and the Game Boy Color and the PlayStation Portable and the PlayStation 1 and the Dreamcast and the Nintendo 64 and the Super Nintendo and the Sega Genesis, the original Nintendo Entertainment System, the Nokia N-Gage, and of course the PC, which had an entirely different library. And let's also not forget that 2005 was also the year that the Xbox 360 debuted. Today, the problem is even worse, because While there are fewer platforms to keep track of, there are about 10 times as many games getting released every year, far more than anyone could ever play. So, how could anyone keep all those games straight? What a lot of people did, and still do, is just focus on the major titles. You know what I mean. Mario, Zelda, Metroid, Halo, Madden, Grand Theft Auto, Metal Gear Solid, Final Fantasy, Resident Evil, Half-Life, The Sims, World of Warcraft. You know, the heavy hitters that a lot of people are familiar with already, and the ones that are really easy to sell because they've already pretty much sold themselves. And let me be honest, just keeping up with the popular releases in a year is enough to keep any gamer busy. There are usually more than enough games to play. But if those still aren't enough for you, what many people then do is hone in on a genre or platform that they like and become an expert in that. So, for example, one of my coworkers really loved his Xbox, and he could talk all day about the best games it had to offer. Another coworker loved the Nintendo GameCube, and they could go really deep talking about that. Another coworker was a PC gamer who'd become a big fan of MMORPGs. And we also had an assistant manager who loved JRPGs and who'd played pretty much every one of them regardless of their popularity or quality. But beyond genre or platform or console expertise, how do you really become knowledgeable about what's out there? Well, you talk about games a lot. You read about them, you research them, you read their online listings, you pick up boxes off the shelf and look at them, and you try them out when you can. You borrow them from other people or ask them to show you what games they're playing. You play demos when you can and watch videos when you can't. You stay curious and pick up popular and less popular games with equal enthusiasm so you can see what they have to offer. You treat gaming like an exploration, and you allow yourself to be excited by every new adventure because maybe, just maybe, you'll get to see something new. That's what I did, and it's what I still do even to this day. And the purpose of this podcast is to share my journeys with you and to help you look at games a little bit differently. Not as objectives to complete or challenges to master or achievement and trophies to tick off a list. There are no backlogs or stacks of shame to worry about, no collectathon urges to give into, no requirement that you complete everything that you start. The journey I'm going to take you on is all about the experience and the love of video gaming. For the last few years, I've been working on this book series called The Greatest Games You Probably Never Played. And it all came out of this idea I had that over time, there have probably been some games that were overlooked and which might be considered classics today if they'd only found their audience. So I started my research with computer games from the 1970s and 80s. I had a few ideas based on the games I'd already played, and I figured I'd find a dozen or two at most. Instead, I found hundreds of them. And when I switched over to consoles from the same time period, I found hundreds more. Now, I'll be honest and say that not every game I've written an article about has been as polished or refined as something like Super Mario Bros. But let's be honest, very few games are anywhere near that level of quality, and if we're going to set an impossible standard, we're pretty much going to stick to the stone-cold classics or the games for which people are already nostalgic. And honestly, a lot of the retro gaming content out there is pretty much just that. Either the games people grew up playing or the ones everyone already knows are good. My criteria were a little different. I was looking for games that had interesting ideas, which didn't require nostalgia goggles to be fun, and which were either largely forgotten, obscure, or completely overlooked. Now, some of the games I picked out were very popular when they were released, but kind of fell through the cracks over time. One example would be the game Starflight, an absolutely incredible Star Trek-style space RPG that was a major hit during its time, but which is long forgotten by most gamers today. So much so that a crowdfunding campaign to make a modern sequel couldn't even get past the halfway point. Then there are the games that weren't hugely popular in their time, but which were still relatively well known. An example of that would be Midwinter, an open-world 3D action game that's quite similar to Far Cry, but obviously a lot more primitive in what it can do graphically because it came out in 1989. It's also still a lot of fun to play today once you master its old school controls. There are also games that were much more popular in Europe than they were in the United States. An example of that would be Paradroid, a really clever stealth infiltration game about using a robot to take over and dismantle other, more powerful robots. It was huge in the United Kingdom, but barely talked about overseas in North America where I grew up. In fact, the UK had such a different scene from the US when it came to gaming in the 1980s and early 1990s that many of the games British gamers regard as classics are still pretty unfamiliar to the rest of the world. And that's also true for Japan, which had a ton of ambitious and interesting computer games that never got ported to consoles or localized for international audiences. Then there are games that seem to be forgotten the moment they arrive, despite their quality. One example is Prophecy: The Fall of Trinidad, a truly engaging 1980s action RPG where you can solve problems in several different ways, often by gathering information from NPCs and working around your enemies instead of hacking them to death. I would never have discovered this game if it hadn't been for a stray mention in an old issue of Computer Gaming World talking about how good it was. It's truly a hidden gem of a game that's still fun to play today. Now, something you should know about me is that I don't play games to get the high score, to complete all the achievements, or master the mechanics, or anything like that. I play games because I'm an explorer at heart, and every new game is, for me, an opportunity to step into a new world that someone else created and to see what their effort has to offer. And I'm not stuck on one particular genre, or era, or platform, or category of game. I have preferences, sure, but I'm open to trying new things and really try to resist the urge to judge games by first appearances, because I've learned from experience that just about anything can be fun if you take the time to search for it. Even really poorly made games like the Cheetah Men or Ninja Bread Man can be fun under the right conditions. But you know what I'm tired of? The way online discourse encourages negativity and gets gamers focused on hating on things. There are also a lot of folks out there who talk down to those who aren't as expert as they are. That's definitely not what I'm about. And if you're looking for that, there are plenty of people who provide that sort of content already. What I'm trying to provide you with is a sense of wonder and excitement that comes with trying new things, or with rediscovering things you didn't think were important when you first came across them. My role is to be your guide, and as we explore this topic together, I'll guide you to things that you might have passed by but never stopped to look at, and I'll also show you things you might have missed or overlooked. Because I'm a researcher professionally, I'm going to share knowledge and insights that come from both my own experience and the considerable amount of research I continue to do, real verifiable facts from true sources. And yeah, we're going to have fun too, because games are supposed to be fun. So, how are we gonna do this? Well, I don't do anything small, and I have 50 episodes planned out for 2026 after this one, all focused on looking at just the 1980s. That may sound like a lot of time to spend on one topic, but the 1980s was an amazing time for gaming because it includes multiple generations of personal computers and home video consoles, handheld LCD games, and cartridge-driven handhelds, including the Atari Lynx and the Nintendo Game Boy. There's also coin-operated arcade games, and of course, formats ranging from cassette tapes to floppy disks to cartridges to laser discs. At the beginning of the decade, gamers were just getting acquainted with Pac-Man and the underground empire of Zork, and the daring dungeons of Rogue, and the crazy shooting mazes of Berserk, and the virtual reality setting of Battlezone. And by the end of the decade, the world was bracing itself for Super Mario Bros. 3, which was already available in Japan, while North American gamers were watching The Wizard to see what the game would even look like, and to chuckle at the scene with the Power Glove. Tetris was the must-have pack-in title for the Game Boy. The Sega Genesis and the TurboGrafx-16 were showing gamers what the Nintendo Entertainment System couldn't do, and the Amiga and Atari ST were showcasing computer games that felt like true arcade games. And speaking of the arcades, boy, they had some amazing games too, like Super Monaco GP, Chase HQ2, Winning Run, Hard Drivin', Golden Axe, Final Fight, Strider, UN Squadron, and my favorite, the arcade version of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, all games that were pushing the boundaries of how video games could look and feel. Over the course of our 50 episodes this season, I'm going to cover some of the notable and not so notable games from different genres and platforms and categories and even regions. We'll talk about games that are made entirely in text or ASCII art, including some that wouldn't make any sense if they included actual graphics. We'll talk about games that are basically tabletop games with computer-driven brains. We'll talk about games that simulate unusual things like running a nuclear reactor or managing a rock band or flying a UFO. We'll talk about games that make sports and racing more interesting with Dragon Quest-style RPG modes. We'll talk about games that found interesting ways to simulate 3D graphics and the first awkward steps into true 3D gaming that we enjoy today. We'll talk about games that contain entire explorable universes in fewer kilobytes than the document file I used to write the script for this episode. We'll talk about how an Atari 2600 adventure game inspired the creation of educational games you'd find in computer labs and how some of those were as sophisticated as anything that you would play for fun. We'll talk about how Western-developed computer games like Mystery House, Ultima, and Wizardry inspired young Japanese game developers to create the genre we now know as the JRPG. We'll talk about how some superstar PC game and arcade game developers went on to create many of the console games we know and love today. And we'll talk about why Japan became such a major source of video games after the home video game and arcade game markets crashed in North America in the mid-1980s. And we'll talk about games that are too weird to be easily categorized. From an adventure game that claims to be based on an unproduced German stage show, to a prog rock computer game narrated by Doctor Who's Jon Pertwee, to a very odd launch title from Electronic Arts that's so uncertain if it's actually a game or not, it has a question mark in its name. Now, if this all sounds good, I hope you'll be back every week to hear where I'm going to take you next. But you can also read my written series on greatestgames.substack.com, where I continue to post new articles twice a week on the greatest games you probably never played. And you're always welcome to talk with me on Bluesky. You can find all of that in the show notes. I'm Sean Jordan. I am your great game guide, and I'll be back next week with more to explore. Before I let you go every week, I'm going to close out the show with a game I want you to try that's a little off the beaten path. This isn't sponsored content. I don't have any financial stake in anything I recommend. These are games that I think are really good, but don't have as much exposure as some of the more popular ones. This week, I'm going to recommend a fairly modern game from 2024 called The Holy Gosh Darn by the developer Perfectly Paranormal and published by Yogscast Games. It's a side-scrolling adventure game you play with a controller, and it's really, really funny. If Adult Swim games were still around, this one would be right up their alley. The premise is that you're a foul-mouthed angel named Cassiel who's sitting around heaven counting all the dogs arriving through the gates because, all dogs go to heaven, right? When an unexpected calamity launches you into a time loop where you're guided by death on a desperate quest to save the afterlife. Using your magical stopwatch, you travel between heaven, hell, earth, and the Norse afterlife of Helheim to solve quite a few problems so you can eventually solve your own by using the holy gosh darn to avert disaster. So, why is Cassiel a foul-mouthed angel? Well, it turns out that in hell, cursing gets you fined, making it a far less enjoyable place than the heavenly realm above, at least in theory. And those angels are really bored and pretty annoyed because while all dogs go to heaven, there hasn't been a human passing through the gates in some time. Also, God's been kind of keeping to himself lately, and Lucifer's in the hospital thanks to the events of another game in this series called Manual Samuel. And you'll also intersect with Pestilence and Bjorn from Helheim Hassel, the other game in this series known right now as the Tuesday Trilogy. All three of these games have some really sharp writing and great voice acting, but since you can play them in any order, the Holy Gosh Darn is actually the one to start with. It's laugh-out-loud funny, and it makes really smart use of its time travel mechanics in ways that I've never seen in games before. For example, you'll run into characters who want to waste your time with really mundane complaints and rants, and you have the ability to interrupt them so you can move things along. The clock is ticking, after all. But if you offend them before you get to that crucial piece of information you need by being too aggressive and demanding that they hurry things up, they'll angrily stop talking and you'll have to let out an exasperated sigh, rewind time, and try again. But once you know something useful, you can then interrupt them and skip ahead without consequence. I love that because it keeps the game from being tedious even when it's repetitive. It's not hard to find the Holy Gosh Darn on sale. It's normally $20, but it was just recently $4 in the Steam Winter Sale, and I got my copy in a bundle on Fanatical for even less than that. My advice is to go to istthereanydeal.com and see where you can find it for a decent price. Or, just go ahead and pay full price to support the developers at Perfectly Paranormal. I'm sure they'll appreciate you either way. The Great Game Guide is a podcast written by me, Sean Jordan, and I also wrote the theme music. This is all 100% human-created content. I don't use AI for any part of my production. This episode is copyright 2026 by me, Sean J. Jordan, and you can find more details in the show notes and on my website at greatestgames.substack.com. And credit where it's due. Any games, artwork, sources, or additional music are the property of their respective owners, used under fair use guidelines and also noted in the show notes. If you enjoyed this episode, please let me know on Substack, Bluesky, or with a nice review. But I'd appreciate it even more if you'd share it with a like-minded friend. Thanks for listening!